Thank you, Victoria. And
Okay.
we look forward to chatting with you more after our final presentation. And our final presentation is coming from Valerie Preston of York University, where Valerie is a professor of environmental and urban change. Valerie is going to present Immigrant Essential Work and Resilience, a comparison among metropolitan areas. Welcome, Valerie.
Hi. Hang on, everybody. Have I got the right screen? Wait a minute. No. Hang on just a minute. Okay. Let me try one more time. That's fine. Okay. Just bear with me, guys, while I try and sort this out. Something's happened to my Zoom. I think I know what the problem is, but I don't know how to fix it, which is about par for the course right now. So hang on a second. Well, I have a look at all this and see if I can fix it. Okay. Hang on. All right. So let me see if I can now share this. Okay. Marcia, am I sharing the right screen? Nope. Yes? Okay. All right. The work I'm going to talk about today is nowhere near as interesting as what you've just heard. Marcia and I were interested in understanding the segmentation of the labor market at a metropolitan level. We wanted to know if immigrant men and women were working in the same industries as Canadian-born men and women. And that has become a topic of tremendous interest with the pandemic, because work greatly affects your chances of contracting the virus. It also affects your ability to work from home. It also affects the chances that you'll be unemployed or your hours will be reduced. And as the mother of now grown children, I am immensely grateful that my kids grew up and left home before the pandemic, because my neighbors are trying to homeschool 2 kids and manage their jobs. And the ease of doing that really depends upon your employment. Marcia and my original interest in this topic comes from the fact that employment is highly segmented. Overall, services are feminized, and construction and manufacturing, the goods producing industries, tend to be male dominated. The other aspect of employment that's segmented is that immigrants tend to be concentrated, not all of them, but many, in dirty, dangerous, and undesirable jobs. And what I find particularly interesting is the fact that when you look at the analyses of the impact of COVID on workers, they concentrate on either gender or immigrant status. So on the left-hand side of what I hope you're seeing is 2 diagrams that were created by RBC Economics at a national level, pointing out that women have been much more likely to fall out of the labor force since February 2020, and that is particularly true for women with children. And on the other side of the screen is a graph from New York City showing that in many of the industries in New York City that the city considers to be frontline industries, there are large proportions of foreign-born workers. And what I find interesting is nobody brings these 2 together. And so what we ended up trying to do in this little paper is figure out the extent to which the jobs of immigrant men and women affect their risks from COVID-19. We used 2016 census information. We compared employment in essential industries for 4 groups, and I'm going to keep referring to those 4 groups: immigrant men and women and Canadian-born men and women. And we looked at workers' employment in those industries across the metropolitan area, some metropolitan areas. So what do we mean by essential work? Essential work is public-facing in many cases, not always. It cannot be done remotely in most cases, and involves often interactions with people particularly vulnerable to COVID, the elderly, the ill, children who have a fairly high risk, who have some risk of catching COVID but don't get sick, thank God. Essential work is identified by industry. I find this fascinating, both in regulation and in the academic literature. We're going to look at 7 industries. The only one that's at all controversial here is education. We included, or I included, education largely because of the debates in Ontario about whether teachers should be providing education in person or online. The teachers clearly feel that it's threatening for them, at least in the primary and elementary grades. Some teachers feel it's a threat for them to go back to work, as do some of the high school teachers. So I included it. And the list of industries there corresponds fairly well to what the public health people have been identifying as essential work. We looked at essential work from a social resilience perspective, and all that means is we wanted to look at the roles of social institutions. The pandemic presents a challenge for everyone. It particularly presents a challenge for women, as I've mentioned, also presents a challenge for immigrants. And a social resilience approach focuses on available formal and informal institutions, the relations among those institutions, and inequality in access to institution. So when I do talk very briefly about policy, we're not going to talk about individual resilience. We're going to talk about institutional responses. This is very unlike the infographic there about 10 ways to build resilience, which is one that really emphasizes this idea that resilience is an individual capacity. I'm interested in how the institutional landscape shapes people's capacities to respond to adverse events. When we looked at employment, we looked at, I'm going to talk about 7 metropolitan areas. I want you to look at the green arrow down here towards the bottom. I want you to notice that in Sherbrooke, Quebec, for example, almost 77% of the workforce is employed in these essential industries. But in Ottawa, Gatineau, which Brian Ray always reminds me is different, he might say special, it's only a little bit more than half the workforce. I also want you to notice that in the large metropolitan areas, Toronto and Montreal, in general, the percentage of the workforce in essential industries is smaller than in the second-tier metropolitan areas. The exceptions are Ottawa, Gatineau, and Quebec City, and these are 2 metropolitan areas, one the national capital, one the provincial capital, which have a very high proportion of employment in public administration and services to businesses, all of which can be done from home. The second thing I want you to notice are these pink arrows. The largest essential industry tends to be wholesale and retail trade, but that is not always the case. Windsor, for example, Francine stands out because manufacturing is almost a quarter of the workforce. I had no idea. And healthcare and social services, manufacturing and healthcare and social services kind of wrestle to be in second place. And in a city like Sherbrooke, which is a very important regional center, healthcare and social services comes out as the second most important employer of the essential industries. So 3 of them, wholesale and retail trade, manufacturing, healthcare and social services, in the top 3, but always sort of juggling for position depending upon which metropolitan area you're looking at. And I want you to keep those metropolitan variations in mind. So we have looked at the distribution of employment for each of our 4 groups of workers across those essential industries. And we have some wonderful diagrams. If I was teaching, I could spend an hour just talking about this one, but I will spare you. There are 3 patterns of employment segmentation. First, if you look at the top industry, construction, utilities, transportation, and warehousing, gender really matters, but it doesn't matter whether you're an immigrant or Canadian born. So the top group are Canadian born women. Then we have Canadian born men, immigrant women, immigrant men. And what I want you to notice is that the percentage of women is always less than the percentage of men. And it is the same for Canadian born and immigrant women. And the percentages of immigrant men and Canadian born men finding work in this sector are also almost identical at around 12%. There's a second, a much larger group of essential industries in which the effects of being a man or a woman and the effects of being immigrant or Canadian born lead to very complicated patterns. So manufacturing, which we've heard a lot about in Toronto, immigrant men clearly have the largest share of the workforce in this essential industry, followed by Canadian born men, then immigrant women, and coming way at the back, Canadian born women. Educational services, it's reversed. Canadian born women have a larger share of their employment in this sector, then immigrant women, Canadian born men, and lowest immigrant men. And so we can go through each of these and pick out which of those 4 groups is finding more opportunities for employment in that essential industry and which one less. The outcome is, if we look at immigrant women, they have a high share of employment in healthcare, accommodation and food services, and other personal services. This means that in terms of the impact of COVID-19, healthcare, of course, was one of the sectors where we expected a lot of transmission, and there was transmission at the beginning of the pandemic. Other personal services and accommodation and food services are 2 of the essential industries most affected by unemployment and reduced hours. In contrast, immigrant men are really overrepresented in manufacturing in Toronto, and they are most likely in manufacturing to experience a risk of contracting COVID and transmitting it because of a crowded workplace. And finally, I'm intrigued by these Canadian-born women in education, very worried about contracting COVID at work. In Montreal, what you find are similar patterns, except for the following. In Montreal, there is no essential industry in which gender and immigration status don't matter. Every industry has this complicated pattern where whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're an immigrant or Canadian born, really affects the share of employment in that industry. The second thing about Montreal that is interesting to me has to do with this construction. The construction, utilities, transportation, and warehousing industry is very much dominated by Canadian-born men in Montreal. It matters which metropolitan area you're looking at, and that shift is really important. The other thing I would note here, the continuing importance of education for Canadian-born women, but I want you to look at healthcare. It's not just that it's female dominated in Montreal, it is really immigrant dominated. And we know from other research that in Montreal, most of those immigrant workers, or a large share of them, are in the bottom part of the occupational hierarchy within healthcare. And these are the workers that are most vulnerable to contracting COVID by working with vulnerable people in long-term care homes, going to people's homes as personal support workers. So The patterns are similar and slightly different in Montreal than they are in Toronto. And the important thing to take away is that it matters what your gender is, but it also matters whether you're Canadian born or immigrant in every single one of these essential industries. And since Kelly is moderating this, Ottawa Gatineau, Brian's right, Ottawa is different. Although I hate to admit it. It appears that—
And you've got 2 minutes to tell us why, Valerie.
Oh, well, I'm going to explain very quickly and come to the conclusions. I've got 2 more slides. Manufacturing in Montreal, in Ottawa Gatineau looks a lot more like Toronto than Montreal does. It matters for men. It's not very important for women. It's actually a minor sector, which we know. But it's interesting to me that it has a similar pattern to the one we see in Toronto. The other thing that I want you to notice is that in Ottawa Gatineau, Canadian-born men are the ones who have the largest share of their employment in wholesale and retail trade. And wholesaling, those are the Amazons of the world, have been identified as a place where workers are really at risk. Now, I do have something to say about Sherbrooke, but I'm going to leave it. But the only thing I want to say is I want you to notice in Sherbrooke, it's immigrants who are working in the education sector. It's really different. So what does all of this mean? Immigrant men and women and Canadian-born men and women work in different essential industries. And those patterns of employment vary from place to place. The relative importance of essential industries varies. The share of each group's employment in essential industries varies, and the relative importance of an individual industry varies. So what does this mean for policy? And I'm not going to have time to talk about this, which is just as well because I haven't thought about it and I'm looking for suggestions. I haven't thought about it enough. It seems to me that if we're going to mitigate the risks of COVID-19, its transmission, the unemployment, the exhaustion people are feeling trying to juggle home and work, we have to have policies that respond to the circumstances of each group of workers in each industry. And we have to take account of the local situation because the patterns of segmentation across essential industries are local. And I think what this means is, I went looking at the policy literature about essential work in the pandemic. If I read one more time that we need sick leave, which paid sick leave for everyone, I agree. But rather than emphasize the details of the policies, I think we have to put more emphasis on the process of policymaking and planning. And it has to be local because the circumstances that pose risks for people that are altering their lives are local. And I think the public health units may provide an example of how we could go local in terms of decision-making and planning. The other thing is that at the local level, if we are going to use a social resilience approach, we have to draw on local institutions and they have to collaborate and coordinate. In Ontario, we have 2 examples, the local immigration partnerships and the workforce planning boards. These are examples of models of collaboration that bring together the full range of institutions in individual municipalities or metropolitan areas. And finally, there has to be coordination. And that coordination we saw with the Syrian Refugee Initiative has to be non-hierarchical. And finally, the thing that we've also learned from the Syrian refugee resettlement is that if we're going to promote collaboration and coordination and effective planning and decision-making, then we have to provide some resources. In Toronto, the vaccination rollout is led by the fire department. The chief of the fire department And I have thought, why is this the case? Well, it's because the fire department is one of the lead agencies for the disaster and emergency management planning in Toronto, as it is in many municipalities and metropolitan areas or regional municipalities. And that is the structure that has been used to organize our pandemic response. So it's worth looking at, because we do know that the disaster and emergency management plans get updated regularly, and it's worth looking to see why that is possible. So let me finish. I've taken more than 2 minutes. Thank you.
Valerie, thank you very much. And thank you